Hi students, welcome back, and this video is going to cover the Heian period, which is the last period that we're going to cover in Japanese history this week. Now, the Heian period is set to date from the time when the capital of the Japanese Empire was moved from Nara to Kyoto. And so Kyoto is more isolated from rival centers of power. Nara, if you remember, was more kind of in the middle of the islands. Kyoto is a little more removed, keeps the emperors a little more safe from the rival clans. Remember, that's kind of the rising power now, is these local landowners and their families. And the emperor moves the capital city to Kyoto, where they're further away from these dangerous landowners. Now, this keeps the capital safe, it keeps the emperor more secure, but it also means that the emperor is a more marginal figure. It means that it's more difficult for him to exercise control. It means that these local landowning families, like the Fujiwara, become more independent. At the same time, this is a period in the late 8th century and into the 9th century, around the year 800, where you have rebellion, civil war, political fragmentation in China, and so Japan becomes further isolated from Chinese independence. And Japanese culture becomes more focused on being uniquely Japanese than in adopting Chinese practices and ideas. Sovereignty, as I explained, was held by the emperor, but power was very much wielded by local nobles and local clans, and the Fujiwara were the most powerful. The warriors that were in the pay of these clans also became more and more powerful, and the emperor used the military to fully establish dominance in the region. The next emperor, the Emperor Daigo, attempted to restrain the Fujiwara and rule directly, but he did not manage to weaken their control. In fact, his own position was weakened, and the local lords became more and more powerful. Their shoguns, which is the name for their territory, became more and more independent. So they were no longer reliant on the emperor approving them to hold these lands. Generally, they held them of their own power, and they were too powerful for the emperor to risk confrontation by disciplining them or trying to weaken their power. And more workers, the same phenomenon that we looked at a little earlier in the material this week. Local workers increasingly transfer the title of their lands to the local lord in order for a share of the harvest. So if you're a local worker, you have to evaluate, is it better for me to have my own land and have that independence, or is it better for me to give up my land to lose that independence, but to ensure that I have a share of a much bigger harvest, and so my odds of getting food, my risk of a weak harvest is less than it would have been otherwise. In this context, the local lords, the local clans become more and more powerful. They consolidate their control of their shoguns, and the emperors become more and more marginalized. The system of centralized taxation comes to the end, and by the year 950, the Fujiwara basically control the emperors. Not necessarily particularly actively, but the emperors don't do anything that isn't approved and accepted by the Fujiwara. This was nevertheless a period of great cultural achievement. As I explained, Japanese culture is now developing more in isolation of Chinese culture than it has previously. And so we see the development and the expansion and the growth of vernacular literature, poetry, which became a staple of court life. Poetry was used in just about every social and public occasion in Japanese culture. Good poetry, being a good poet was considered an excellent route to a high-ranking government career. Similarly, handwriting and calligraphy was seen as reflecting the state of a person's soul. Indigenous Japanese art known as yamoti, which you can see in the lower picture here, was considered a particularly vividly colored, characteristically Japanese form of painting. This was also developed and promoted by the emperors and the local lords at this time. power of the Shogun continued to expand, and the Taiho Code, this sort of Confucian system of government or Confucian-based system of government that we looked at early with the Soga clan, basically collapsed and disappeared. So the Soga dynasty and these early Japanese dynasties had established this Japanese constitution and code that provided for a more centralized government in order to provide stability and security. Basically, that's collapsing at this point, and instead, power, security, and stability is found in the hands of local aristocrats who control much of the land. But of course, they fight with one another. For those who don't earn land, the main way to advance in this society was by becoming a professional soldier. Military service became part of the life of the workers who lived on the lands of the aristocrats who controlled the Shogun. The most capable soldiers became the most powerful and the most successful members of this society below the aristocrats. We see an emergence of professional warriors who are hired directly by the emperor as well as by the local aristocrats. Taken together, these two warriors, two sets of warriors who are now becoming adept at the use of bows and the use of cavalry and the use of swords. Taken together, these professional warriors, controlled by the aristocrats and by the emperors, they form a military class, become known as the samurai. After the year 1073, loss of food, or at least a decline in the amount of food per person with a growing population, led to a breakdown of the Fujiwara clan and their hold over the emperor, and saw instead the rise of other powerful dynasties like the Taira and Minamoto clans. There was a new emperor as well, so you have these two new rising clans, you have the Fujiwara clan, and you have the emperors. The new emperor, Go-Sancho, attempted to re-establish centralized control. So you have these three clans who are fighting it out amongst each other for dominance, but you also have the emperors trying to make a comeback and reassert the control over their powerful subordinates. And Go-Sancho tried to do this through what's known as In-no-Cho, which is the office of the cloistered emperor. That basically meant that outwardly he wasn't extremely politically involved, but behind the scenes he was working typically with the Taira and Minamoto clans, not necessarily to advance their interests, however, but more in order to weaken the Fujiwara and strengthen imperial power. Fujiwara began to fight amongst themselves, and by the 1150s, their power over the central court was broken, and the Taira clan emerged as dominant. However, in 1183, they were overthrown by Yoritomo Minamoto. And Yoritomo Minamoto established a Bakufu system that would govern Japan for the next 7 centuries. This is a system of government in which military governors, otherwise known as shugo, S-H-U-G-O, were appointed to rule over the different provinces. So it's a re-establishment of some kind of centralized control, but it's coming through a local aristocrat. It's not coming from the emperors. The emperors still exist. They're just extremely marginal figures. And you have this Minamoto clan that's the most powerful clan, and they're appointing military governors over local regions. And this was the system that would dominate Japan for the next 7 centuries. Culture during the Heian period witnessed the rise of Tendai Buddhism, which is sort of a Japanese version of Mahayana Buddhism. We had talked about this in the history of India. It's a type of Buddhism that is more of a religion than a philosophy, approaches the Buddha as more of a divine being than a philosophical guide. And so this was introduced to Japan and became popular during this time. Beauty was considered extremely important in this culture. It's considered an important part of what made someone a good person. But they had fashions of beauty that today we would consider quite strange. Aristocratic men and women powdered their faces but blackened their teeth. So you have the contrast between the white face and the black teeth. The men would wear very faint moustaches and goatees, and women's mouths were painted small and red. Their eyebrows were plucked or shaved and redrawn higher on their foreheads. And so this is the culture of Japan around the year 1200. It's a culture that has a growing system of literature, language. It's a culture in which beauty is important. It is politically fragmented and pretty confused between the emperors who still exist, who have a long history of succession but who are not particularly powerful, and the local warrior or the local aristocratic clans who are the most powerful, and then under them professional warriors who are often appointed to rule particular districts of Japan. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will see you in week 8.